Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being, Totality and Infinity, Emmanuel Levinas. We're still in section 1, the same in the other, but this is going to be the last video in this section, and we'll deal with the two subsections, the two final subsections, truth and justice, and separation in the absolute in this video. And we'll start by looking at freedom. So for Levinas, freedom is not, as it was for Sartre, something that it's not absolute, it's not total, we're not condemned to be free. Rather, our freedom can be called into question. And that for Levinas is the key to understanding ourselves, the eyes that we are. So our freedom can be called into question, and it can be called into question in two ways. The first is the consciousness of failure. And this involves us discovering a limit when we think about our origins, when we think about how we came to be. And the idea here is, could I have freely chosen my existence or my non-existence? And the answer is obviously no. This is Heidegger's idea of us being thrown into the world. We didn't choose to be here. I didn't choose to be born or have the life or any of the kind of the factical elements that make up my life. I didn't choose any of that. I just am. So without that ability to ground our own freedoms, to ground our own freedoms, our own origins, our own beginnings, we discover a limit here. And this is the limit that Levinas is talking about when he calls this a consciousness of failure. So with that in mind, then it means that we as individual cogitos, as consciousnesses, if you like, to use a word that Levinas doesn't use, but we as beings that we are, we can't found theory or truth ourselves, because all of this stuff has to exist. We're just thrown into this world in which theory and truth and objects and all these kinds of things that already exist. So we can't ground them in ourselves. And in fact, the beings that we are proceed from these. We proceed from facts, theory, knowledge of the world. All of this precedes us. So we come in afterwards. So the point that Levinas is trying to make here is that we can't make ourselves the center point of anything, of a theory of knowledge, of a theory of mind, of metaphysics. We're always kind of late to the party. It's already going on, and we have emerged from that. So we can't ground it in ourselves, and we can't ground our own freedoms in ourselves either. And he calls this particular way of calling into question our freedom, the consciousness of failure, he calls this theoretical, and says that it's an attempt to prove our freedoms. And in that sense, it fails, because we can't ground our freedom in anything. It's just a brute fact, if you like. It presupposes everything that came before it. And we'll talk more about the importance of that idea a little bit later. But the second way that our freedom can be called into question is through the consciousness of guilt. And this arises when we come face to face with an other, when we come before that other, measuring ourselves against, is the way that Levinas puts it, measuring itself against an infinity, an other that is absolutely transcendent, absolutely an absolute alterity. So when we come into this relation with an absolute other, that's when this consciousness of guilt arises, and it is accomplished as shame. So this consciousness of guilt is kind of manifested as shame. And he says that the freedom that we are discovers itself as murderous, even. So he even goes that far. We are hence shame, guilt, all of these ideas. Why shame, though? I'll come to that in just a minute, but it's worth noting at this point that we saw the consciousness of failure came after facts, theory, the world. But this consciousness of guilt precedes all of that. It precedes the theory. It precedes truth. It precedes facts. And this is because it's as we see, it's revealed in shame, which is something prior to the intellect, the analytical kind of reasoning mind. So we're predating this stuff. So it's deeper than and into the intellectual level. So in that sense, it's different from the consciousness of failure. But why shame? I've got a quote for you, which I'll read, and then we'll break down a little bit in a minute. The other is a revelation of a resistance to my powers that does not counter them as a greater force, but calls in question the naive right of my powers, my glorious spontaneity as a living being. So when I enter into this relationship with the transcendent other, the other in resisting me, in proving to be something that I can't totalize, I can't bring into a relation where we are just two parts of one system, the other reveals to me a power which destroys the other by totalizing them. So the fact that they set themselves up as this other which I can't totalize makes clear to me for the first time what I am, my nature, the nature of my freedom, which is a totalizing force, which looks to everything and tries to bring it into its own orbit, so that there is just that one system. So even if there are two nodes, if you like, to the system, two poles, there's still just one system, and that system is me, is I. But when the other resists me, they show me that the true nature of my freedom, which is this that totalizing force. Hence, Levinas calls that freedom murderous. It looks to destroy the other's independence, the other's freedom, the other's absolute alterity. It looks to destroy that and bring it into a relation with me, relative to me. So something that is a totality. And that lets me see that my formerly glorious, unlimited freedom now appears arbitrary and violent. And at this point, when we realize this is the beginning of morality, which is to say an attempt to make our freedom just, an attempt to make my freedom just. And just here just means that relation with the other, with another person. That is what justice is for Levinas. It's that relation which keeps the other, lets the other preserve their alterity, their independence. And that's justice. And that's where morality begins. The attempt to make our freedoms, previously absolute, total, to make them to let them make sense in a relationship where there's another which is not me and which can't be reduced to a totality that is kind of centered on me. Okay, so that's cool. So we've got this consciousness of failure, consciousness of guilt. Those are the two ways that our freedom is called into question. But then what can we do with this freedom? So we're left with this a freedom that we can't ground in anything, we can't prove, and a freedom that is arbitrary and violent, murderous. So where do we go from here? Well, into what Levinas calls the investiture of freedom. So he starts here by asking, how can we know ourselves critically? That is to say, how can we liberate our freedom from the arbitrary, from that violent kind of murderous arbitrariness that we found we were nothing more than? Well, first of all, he says we're not condemned to be free. So this is directly against Sartre, who obviously we were absolutely free for Sartre, but Levinas is pretty much the exact opposite of that. Our freedom is constantly called into question by the other. So we're not condemned to be free. We're not totally free, as per Sartre. And through another possibility, the I can justify itself in a totality of everything, a totality of the world, i.e. kind of Spinoza or Hegelian type of philosophy. But if we go that route, then we actually lose our freedom because we become nothing more than a reflection of a universal order. So we're no longer completely independent. We're wrapped up in a system. We're wrapped up in a totality already. Just one that it's not necessarily relative to me. I'm relative to this universal order. Neither of those are appealing to Levinas. So we're going to have to begin with that sense of shame that Levinas identifies earlier. And he calls this that sense where we come into contact with the other as an absolute alterity. That's our conscience. So it's an interesting use of that word, an interesting kind of redefinition, which sheds some light on the human condition. So we start with shame, this feeling that my freedom is something destructive, and it's brought about by this calling into question of the self by the other, which is the conscience part of this. And so what we find then, what we need here is, in recognizing that shame through that kind of the call of conscience here, we need a submission in morality before the other, before that other who measures me with a gaze incomparable to the gaze by which I discover him. So we're looking to, instead of fight against this other, we want to submit, we want to yield, let the other be this absolute alterity, this complete independence from me that I can't, that I don't have any control over, that I can't bring into any kind of totalizing relationship. And that what we're saying here is that we must not then turn inwards. We must not look to a for itself. We're not turning back upon ourselves, or even a know thyself, which is again internally directed. Rather, for Levinas, the secret is the putting back into question of the self, the turning back to what is prior to oneself in the presence of the other. The presence of the other, a privileged heteronomy, does not clash with freedom, but invests it. And so, again, the idea here is that we're not trying to ground our freedom in ourselves, which is pretty much what most other philosophies try and do, right? There's that sense of, at least the Western anyway, that sense of grounding our freedoms in ourselves as this independent subjectivity. And it's very existentialist, a very existentialist way of looking at it too. Grounding ourselves in who we are. Look inwards and kind of orient yourself from there. Know thyself. This is all pointing into the core of who we are. Levinas is saying, let's go the other way. Let's look out let's question that absolute freedom that we take ourselves to be. Let's question this total subjectivity and put it into a relation with another which is beyond our control, beyond our freedom. And so this submission then, this letting go of the impossible desire to ground one's own freedom is kind of the key point here. And so while the atheism of the I, that separation that we talked about in the last video, while that precludes a justification of freedom, we can't justify our freedom, we can't ground our freedom, the face-to-face, that through justice with and before the other, that face-to-face avoids the arbitrariness of our freedom because the I is invested as freedom by the other. And that's really the key point here. We can't ground our own freedom, we can't justify our own freedom, but we can, but even though we can't do that, our freedom can be justified, invested, that's Levinas's word, invested as freedom, not by ourselves, but by the other. And so that's our freedoms then kind of, in a sense, get their grounding, get their legitimacy, if you like, through the other. And that's really, I think, a central theme in all of Levinas. And if I had to pick out one, in fact, it seems like this is the key idea for Levinas, and everything just kind of flows around that relation with the other, that relation to this transcendent absolute alterity is what Levinas starts from, and everything kind of flows out of that. And really, that's everything just arises from that relation. And we'll see that again and again, I think, as we go through the book. So that's freedom. The next section I want to look at is truth and justice. So before we get into this in any great detail, I just want to clarify something, because in the last video I defined, was it the last video? I think it was. I think it was the first one. I defined truth as a quest outwards towards a being other than the same. And I think that's wrong, actually. As I was reading through my notes for this video, it didn't quite gel with what I was reading. So I went back and made some changes, went back to the book itself as well. And that's not the right definition of truth, I think, for Levinas. Rather, truth is more like the real. It's almost, in a sense, absolute certitude. It's a complete understanding of the real, I guess, maybe is how I'd describe it, truth. But the point that Levinas was making with that section, with that bit about being a quest outwards towards a being other than the same, is that the truth can only be realized in a relation with such a being other than the same. Which is to say, it's not the typical kind of correspondence theory of truth that we usually think of when we think of true, as in, I've got a picture or an image in my head, does it match what's out there in the world? That kind of objective truth is not what Levinas is about. But truth is not, it's not the quest outwards, it's not that relation itself. Rather, truth arises from that relation. I wish to say that truth arises from the relation with the other, again. Like everything in Levinas, everything arises out of that. It's just a matter of unpicking how that happens. So with that cleared up, truth is basically having the right understanding of the world, knowing what the real is, if you like, what reality is. The main idea in this section is that truth presupposes justice. So truth presupposes that relation with the other. And we start by imagining the I in atheism, the I completely separate, as a spontaneous freedom, unconcerned with justifying its existence, secure in its interiority, right, total in what it is and where it is. That is to say, completely alone. An I not before an other. An I that's completely self-sustaining, if you like. It's completely independent. And we can ask, is there truth here? Is there certitude here? Is anything that we come to know, can we call that truth? And Levinas answers no. Such a world, if there could be a being which was truly independent in this way, such a world would be anarchic. It would be without principles, completely lacking in significance or meaning, completely arbitrary. There'd be no sense in which the word true means anything, because there's no other to question it. There's no other to formulate truth with. Whatever I say is kind of the way things are. Everything's relative to me. There's no sense in which there's any, I mean, like I say, everything's relative, which is to say everything's arbitrary. There is no sense in which the word true means anything anymore. If there is this complete, totally independent freedom. And he talks about, in this section, he talks about the world then being, it would always be under suspicion of an evil genius. It would always be, there'd be no way to confirm anything, because the word confirmation wouldn't mean anything. How could you confirm it? What would you confirm it against? And another nice expression he uses here is, he calls this a silent world, a world where there is no discourse, where there is no such thing as conversation, where even the idea of questioning, interrogating doesn't make sense, because when I interrogate, nothing answers back to me. There is no answer, because there's nothing that can answer. Everything's centered on me. So that's a really interesting way of kind of thinking about this, and it's very opposed to the kind of Cartesian picture, right, where you've got this nucleus of the self looking out on the world, and in that sense, this nucleus of the self is completely isolated. It's completely wrapped up in itself and its interior, and even a little bit, you get that sense in some of the other existentialists as well. There's this sense of the subject, the focus on the subject as the locus of everything, as where meaning comes from this local, this centralized point, which is me, my subjectivity. So that's a really interesting idea, and again, just reinforcing the notion that an independent, isolated I cannot get you to truth, cannot get you to any kind of meaningful truth. Next, we look at Descartes' cogito. So Levinas has an interesting argument against Descartes' cogito here. He says that Descartes thought he had found the one kind of unshakable principle on which to build his philosophy, and that principle obviously is I am, I exist. And we got there by doubting everything. If we doubt everything, eventually we come to this one kernel that we can't doubt, and that's the I, that's the cogito, and we start from there to build our picture of the world, our epistemology. Everything starts from that cogito. But for Levinas, that can't be the first certitude, he says. And the problem, as he puts it, is that the thinking subject which denies its evidences ends up at the evidence of this work of negation at a different level from that at which it had denied. And basically what he means by that is, so Descartes took the world, took mathematical truth, took everything and doubted it, and found that it was all doubtable. Everything, it was all doubtful. Everything could be doubted. And so there's in that process of doubting, there's one thing that is kind of outside it, which is the cogito, the one doing the doubting, right? By definition, as the thing that is doubting everything, it stands outside the boundaries of the things that we're doubting. And so we've got this one thing which then must be true. But Levinas is saying that thing that is standing outside the boundaries of the doubtable hasn't been subjected to this rigorous process of doubt, this method of doubt of Descartes. And if we want to, what we should actually do is doubt that as well. And there's an infinite regression, because we'll always be able to step back from that, doubt that cogito that was doing the original doubting, and doubt the cogito that was doubting the cogito that was doing the original doubting, and so on and so forth. But however far back you go, you're always you never this process of doubt never succeeds in doubting everything. So Descartes doesn't get to a fundamental certitude. That's the argument anyway. For me, it doesn't quite stack up. What he's trying to show is that the I cannot arrive at certitude by itself, in and of itself. We can't get to truth by ourselves. And obviously, eventually we're going to get to the idea of truth through the other. But the point that Levinas is trying to make here is that we can't arrive at certitude ourselves. But I don't think this critique of Descartes works, because it assumes that the I is outside is external to the things that we're doubting. So it assumes that we're doubting everything, the world, the objects, and in order to do that doubting, I as the doubter have to be outside that circle. And I don't think that's true. The point of Descartes' argument is that I can doubt everything, but when I try and doubt myself, that doesn't make sense. I can't doubt that I exist, because just the very fact that I'm having thoughts are happening in this space of whatever I am. The fact that thoughts are happening, the fact that doubting is going on here, means that I, whatever I might be, exist to do the doubting. Even if there's an evil genius implanting those doubts, they're implanting those doubts somewhere into something, and that something's me. So whatever, there's just, Descartes' point is not that I'm outside everything that's being doubted, or that's not the correct interpretation of Descartes' argument, I think. The point is that we can doubt everything, but the one thing we can't doubt, not because it's external to everything being doubted. The one thing that I can't doubt is my own existence. And what proves that is the fact that doubting is happening, doubting is going on in this central point that we call the cogito. So that's, I think the argument doesn't work. And by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but that infinite regression is not actually an infinite regress for Levinas. He says it will eventually stop at the there is, being itself, existence itself. So there's no infinite regress, but there's still this kind of progression back until you get to just raw existence, raw being. But like I say, I don't think that works, because that's not. I don't think that's the correct interpretation of Descartes' argument. Still, having said that, Levinas's point, I take Levinas's point. I take it well. The fact that he's trying to get away from this idea of grounding everything in ourselves as these independent, isolated entities. Instead, he wants to direct ourselves outwards to find truth, to ground our freedoms, for everything. He wants to direct ourselves outwards to the other person, that transcendent other. So I think the motivation of Levinas here is correct, but the execution is missing for this particular argument anyway. But anyway, that's what Levinas has to say about that. So that's kind of the negative anyway. There's no truth in a world where I am alone, where everything's kind of centered on me. I am this independent other, and Descartes' cogito doesn't get us there. Doesn't because that's what it is essentially. It is an independent, isolated entity. It also doesn't get to the truth of things. So what is Levinas's picture? So we attain truth only in the relation with the other. I've said that about 1,000 times already in this video. And the way that he looks at it is through objectivity. And he has a really interesting notion here. He says objectivity has been underestimated. And this is a very interesting move by a phenomenologist, an existentialist, because the idea in general with others in this area is to kind of bring everything back to that focus on subjectivity, to relate everything to subjectivity. I mean, at its core, that's what phenomenology is: taking first-person experience seriously. But what he's doing here is basically doing the opposite and saying objectivity is the important thing. Not in the scientific sense, again, which the science is kind of Cartesian based. There's this kernel of a cogito which is separate from the world out there. The world out there is objective, and me in here, the I in here, is subjective. That's just Cartesianism writ large, really. But Levinas is going to go in a slightly different direction. So objectivity has been underestimated. What we saw with Kant was that truth requires those a priori categories, which are kind of, in a way, projected onto things, which form this framework in which everything conforms when we see it, when we perceive the thing in itself. We don't know what it really looks like. All we know is what it is, what it appears to be, through the categories that we apply to it, that we bring to the picture. And that was Kant's Copernican revolution, right? Same with Heidegger. For Heidegger, truth lies in practical activity. So again, centered on the subject, Dasein, Dasein's goals, Dasein's projects. Everything takes the being of everything, the being of objects, all derive from that, from Dasein. And that's where the train ends for Heidegger. It all leads back to all of the, I forget the in order tos and for relations. They all ultimately cash out, or they ultimately end at a for Dasein. I forget the exact terms he uses, but the kind of connection between the relation between everything ends up ultimately at for the purpose of a Dasein, which is bringing everything back to the subject in exactly the same way that Kant did. All objects ultimately derive meaning from a subject. For Levinas, however, objects are objects only when they are posited in a discourse, in a conversation which proposes the world. This proposition is held between 2 points which do not constitute a system, a cosmos, a totality. So objectivity, signification, intelligibility, this is what we're talking about here. They can't come from one who remains in interiority, from one who remains locked away, secure and safe in their tower of solitude. Rather, it can only come from the face of the other, Levinas says. It can only come from that relation with an absolute alterity, posited in a discourse, in a conversation which proposes the world. So there has to be this communion with another which is not reducible to me, but which stands alone, stands on itself, stands by itself. And then when there is that connection there, then we get, for the first time, the possibility of objectivity, because the thing is truly an object. It's not connected back to me. Its objectivity doesn't depend on me and my goals and my projects and my desires. Now there's this other which has nothing to do with me. And the object now has, again, like I say, meaning for the first time, because it's related to someone else, which has someone who has no connection to me. So it gets this other point of reference. And that's what gives the object its objectivity. That's what makes it an object. Otherwise, it's just another part of me. It just becomes drawn into my subjectivity, the totality of my subjectivity. So he says, another quote, "To have meaning is to be situated relative to an absolute, that is, to come from that alterity that is not absorbed in its being perceived." So that's basically what I was saying before. Meaning can only come from a viewpoint that is different from me, that has nothing to do with the totality that I am. When it can be situated in reference to a point that is completely other to me, that is completely outside, that's not absorbed in a relation with me. And so this relation then, being situated relative to an absolute, can only take place in language, discourse, which I said just before. So Levinas says the object then is thematized by the other. And in thematizing it, they stand ready to interpret this thematization, or as Levinas puts it, to come to the assistance of his discourse. And that is teaching for Levinas. So a couple of key words there: thematize, so the other in speaking and talking about the object and positing the object is kind of bringing meaning to it for the first time. And the fact that they stand there ready to come to the assistance of their discourse, to back up their discourse, that's teaching. And it's obviously different from the usual meaning of the word, but for Levinas, that word means the world is not a silent world anymore, which was the world that we saw before when it was just me. My cogito was everything. The world is not silent now. The fact that an other can respond and back up their responses, can respond to my interrogations, then we have now this, for the first time, truth, for the first time, objectivity. For the first time, objects become objects. So in all of this, there is an importance placed on speech, the importance of discourse, where speech is not just another kind of symbolism, which is how we normally think of speech, right? Just symbols which represent other things. This doesn't work for Levinas because all symbolism presupposes meaning. And as we've just seen, all meaning presupposes discourse, which has everything to do with the other. So symbolism doesn't lead to discourse or doesn't precede discourse, rather discourse precedes symbolism. Because without that relation with the other, there is no such thing as language. There is no such thing as conversation. The other thing I wanted to say here is that in that thematization, that's right, the giving of speech, it's a nice expression, the giving of speech. Objects lose their phenomenality and become fixed. They lose that. Another word that Levinas uses there is, I think it's apparition. They lose their character of being an apparition and kind of not suddenly, but they become fixed. They gain objectivity. They reach objecthood, if you like. So I've got a quote for this. The proposition relates the phenomenon to the existent, to exteriority, to the infinity of the other. The infinite, against which every definition stands out, is not defined, does not offer itself to the gaze, but signals itself not as a theme, but as thematizing, as him starting from whom everything can be fixed in its identity. And so the point that I wanted to make there is, or a couple of points, I guess. The first one is that objects become fixed. So this is a very different way of thinking about objectivity in relation to other existentialists, right? Who have a very kind of fluid almost sense of objectivity. Levinas is really trying to ground things and make them what they are, fix them in something certain. But that certitude isn't already out there. It's only derived through a relation with the other. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that the other is always distant. So just reinforcing that idea, they're always separate. Never a theme, only a thematizing. That's how we apprehend the other. And we can't trace a path back to the other from their signs, because deduction is a mode of thinking that applies to objects already given. The interlocutor cannot be deduced, for the relationship between him and me is presupposed by every proof. Nice. So again, everything comes back to the other. And that's the starting point. There's nothing prior to that. There's no such thing as deduction. There's no such thing as deducing the other, because deduction depends on the other. There's no such thing as truth without the other, because truth depends on the other. All of these things, like I said, that's a real central theme in Levinas. And finally, in the section, I want to close with just a distinction that Levinas draws between certitude and truth. So certitude, he says, arises from a solitary freedom, whether it be a priori concepts, whether it be the adherence of the will, as in Descartes, in which one's freedom assumes responsibility for the true. So the subject takes on all of the burden of the responsibility, all of the burden of truthhood, of making the object, of objectifying the object. And that's because one is an absolute freedom. There is no, one is that totally independent cogito. So that's certitude, and he contrasts this with truth, in which my freedom is called into question through that conscience, which is that opening up to the other, the other by resisting me, by resisting my freedom, calls me forth to, or calls my freedom into question. Remember, that's what conscience is. So my freedom's called into question, and I cannot assume responsibility, because responsibility comes from the other. The object gets its objectivity from the other. Truth is thus always in society for Levinas. Truth is always derives from association. That's what grounds truth, objectivity, meaning. And as we saw in the first section, freedom, our freedom as well, gets its legitimacy. It's invested by the other. All right, let's have a look at the last section, separation. So here Levinas is basically asking the question driving this section: is a being founded in separation, atheism, not then arising from a kind of fallenness? So we're not starting from this position of I guess inauthenticity. That's not a word that Levinas uses, but it kind of ties us back to Heidegger. Obviously the word fallenness leads us back to Heidegger as well. So Levinas is just asking, are we not presupposing that the being that we are is fallen in some way? And his response is, this would only be the case if the separation was based on need, which would mean that there's a lack in the subject. There's a sense of insufficiency in the subject, in the I. But if that were true, then the separated being would be dependent on an exterior. So it would be, that is to say, it would not really be separate in the first place. If the separation depended on need, was based on need, a need for something external to itself, then it means there's a lack in the subject, and that means the subject is not self-contained anymore. It's not truly separate. So he sees a connection back to Greek metaphysics here with Plato. Greek metaphysics conceived the good as separate from the totality of essences. The good is good in itself and not by relation to the need to which it is wanting. It is a luxury with respect to needs. So the good is just good in itself, not in relation to anything else. It's not good if something else happens. It's not good in this situation, but not good in that situation. It's just good in itself. And for Levinas is the same, he sees the same thing with the separated individual. The separated individual is content in itself. It's happy because it doesn't need anything. It doesn't need anything external to itself. The desire, that metaphysical desire, is founded on separation, so it requires that separation first, remember. Without that separation, there is no desire. But the desire is not a need. It doesn't arise because something's lacking in the separated individual, in the separated I. The I is content. The desire arises not out of anything that's missing in me, but out of that relation which kind of calls me into it, which calls me before it. So that the desire arises through the other, from the other. It's like the attraction goes. It's like there's an attractive force pulling me towards it. I'm content in myself, but then there's this other which arises, which appears, and suddenly I'm drawn to this relation with this transcendent other, even though I'm not lacking anything. I'm not insufficient in any way in and of myself. So the separation is not a degradation or a diminution of the infinite. There's nothing missing here. There's nothing lacking. It's not fallen. I'm not in a state of fallenness. I'm not in a state of needing anything to be complete, to be content. Rather, that separation and the desire that's aroused in me from the other as a result of the other's presence, that's what opens the infinite in the first place. So there's no the idea that the separation here arises from a kind of fallenness for Levinas just doesn't pan out, because I'm not negative in any way. I'm not lacking in anything. I am complete and whole in myself. The desire that I have for that transcendent alterity is something which is motivated by the other, not from a deficiency in me. So I'm not fallen. Contra to Heidegger's position, obviously. Now, finally, he takes the somewhat dubious step of tying this notion of metaphysical desire and separation to creation ex nihilo. So he sees that kind of ex nihilo creation as an existence which breaks with the system, so is independent, while still having a kind of relationship with it, which is the dependence. So it's a kind of an independent dependence. But there are lots of those kinds of. By now, we've read Sartre and Heidegger and all of the other guys, Merleau-Ponty. Contradictions come with the territory, really. But the important thing, and they're not just random. They're not just contradictions thrown out there. They're contradictions that get at something meaningful. Get at something that goes beyond concepts, I think, that we tend to see the world in, to frame the world in. So yeah, and like I say, the whole thing here, this notion that we are and I, a being which is separate, completely independent, and completely content in its independence, not lacking anything, but suddenly has this metaphysical desire for the other. So there is an independence, but then there is this sense of there is a dependence creeping in here, which sounds contradictory, but when you examine it, I think in a bit of detail, I think it's not contradictory, because the dependence, if you like, that connection that's drawing me to the other is not coming from a deficiency. It's coming from an attractive force from the other, being exuded, I guess, in a way, from the other. So when you break it down like that, there isn't the contradiction. It's not as contradictory as it seems to be. Still, the connection to creation ex nihilo seems a little bit suspicious here. Maybe, I mean, okay, God created us from nothing, created the universe from nothing, and it is completely independent, but there's still this connection to God. There's still, again, not in the sense that we're missing anything, we're lacking, but in the sense that God is like this attractive force, this force that is drawing us towards it. Maybe, yeah, I guess there is. It does fit in quite nicely. Actually, it is quite clever. That's what I kind of think about the connections that. I mean, I really like what I'm reading, what I've read here, what I'm saying. But as the connections to religion, to Christianity, to Judaism, they always just, I don't know, it's just, to me, it's just over and above what's required, you know. I mean, it's taking what is really solid philosophy and just projecting it into the realm of wild speculation for me. But yeah, that makes sense to me, I guess. I wasn't on board with it at first, but just explaining it now, it does make sense. And it is clever. I mean, I definitely give Levinas credit for that. These connections that he makes between his philosophy and things in the Bible and doctrine, you know, Christian or Judaic doctrine and dogma. They are clever, and they often are. They often do shed light on things, on things related to, or on human existence, I should say, on the what it is to be a human being, to exist as humans. I disagree with the religious aspect, but maybe you like it. Whatever, it's clever, I think. So the same thing about Kierkegaard. Very insightful notions, ideas, but and really clever connections drawn. But yeah. If you like it, you like it, and if you don't, you don't. Let's have a look at a summary. So first we looked at freedom, and we saw that freedom could be called into question for Levinas, and that's the key, actually. The key to understanding, the key to truth is this calling into question of freedom. And there were two ways to do that. The consciousness of failure, which resulted from the fact that consciousness, or the I, cannot ground itself. We can't ground our own freedom. And the second way was the consciousness of guilt, which arose in that relation before the other, that face-to-face relation. And this consciousness of guilt was accomplished as shame. So, again, shame in the sense that the other, in resisting our freedoms reveals our freedom to us as what it really is, which is murderous. It's destructive. It takes away from the other. It tries to reduce the other to a system to a totality with me, rather than letting the other stand on its own. But for Levinas, the answer to the problem of freedom, if I can phrase it that way, is that the other invests our freedom. So while we can't completely justify or completely ground our freedom, I should say, through the other investing us with freedom, our freedom is no longer arbitrary, at least. We lose that kind of arbitrariness that plagued our freedom from the beginning. And that arises only through the relation with the other. Then we looked at truth. And I had to quickly redefine this one, actually, as kind of the real, the correct understanding of reality, maybe. And we looked at objectivity here. We looked at the whole idea of truth through the lens of objectivity, which for Levinas has been underestimated. And this was that kind of unique move away from the subject, away from everything, pivoting towards the subject and being oriented towards this locus, which is the subject. So objectivity only arises in the face of the other, which is to say situated relative to an absolute. So it's only when the other kind of, we need the other for objectivity to arise, for meaning to arise. Without the other, everything is arbitrary. Again, like our freedom. Our freedom is arbitrary without the other. And discourse was important here because that thematizes objects. That's the way that the other thematizes objects. That is to say, gives meaning to objects, objectifies objects, brings significance into the world for the first time. And there was a little distinction between the words certitude and truth, certitude being the freedom of an absolute I, self-contained, whereas truth was that broader notion of of reality, of certitude arising from an absolute other, from a relation with an absolute other. Finally, we looked at separation, and we saw that this is not fallenness. We're not, in being separate, and being separated, we are not in a state of fallenness. That would only be true if our separation was based on our separation aroused in us a need. That is to say, we are lacking something and need something external to us in order to be complete. Since that's not the case for Levinas, the separation that we've been talking about is not a state of fallenness. Okay, that is this video. It's the last video of section 1. We'll make a start on section 2 in the next video. As always, thanks for listening. You know what I'm going to say. I hope you learned something interesting. I hope this helped you in some way. And I'll catch you in the next one. See you then.